My name is Faith. My mother named me Faith because she asked God to make her baby special. The problem is, she does not want me to have the special gifts God gave me. My relationship with my mother has been, for the lack of a better word, difficult since I was 5 years old. I can remember things that happened all the way back to when I was in my mother's womb. At the age of 5, I started telling her what was about to happen. I would tell my mother about my daydreams, and each time that daydream would become reality. I would also tell her about the people I would see that no one else could see. I told her about the old woman in the driveway of our new home. On the day we moved in, there was an old woman in the driveway walking beside me, and when I looked at her, she said hello. I told my mother she was an old white woman with gray hair in a ball on top of her head, just like my hair. Just a different color. She said that she had lived in the house a long time and died in the house last year. My mother laughed and said, Faith, I will not hear of such tales, and walked away, but she knew I was telling the truth. Remember it as if it were yesterday. My mother returned a few moments later and said, help your brother move those boxes into his room. The look on her face was fear and anger at the same time. Later that week, my parents hired my older cousin to babysit my brother and me. My parents went out a lot because of my father's job. I never saw that much of my father, he was always working, and we would be asleep when he came home, but on Saturday mornings, he would spend time with us. My father was never afraid of me. I remember he would always say I was Daddy's little fortune teller and smile. That's strange. I am just now realizing that no matter what I told him, he never had a look of fear on his face. Anyway, this one particular night, Lisa, our babysitter, my brother, and I were sitting in my bedroom talking and laughing, and you know how sometimes, when the TV is off and you are in a well-lit room, you can see your reflection in it. I remember looking at the TV and seeing an extra person. A man with long hair was wearing a white robe. I said, everyone, raise your hand, and of course, Lisa and my brother raised their hand, thinking we were playing a game. I said, okay, see, that man did not raise his hand, as I pointed to the TV. At that point, Lisa and my brother Paul ran out of the room. Faith smiled and said, I can laugh about it now, but I remember being mad because Jesus didn't raise his hand and fade away. After that, Lisa said, let's just watch TV in the family room. Once my parents returned home, I could hear Lisa and my mother talking in the kitchen. I heard Lisa say she was afraid. I went to my room, and a few minutes later, my mother came in and talked to me about scaring people with those stories. I just cried and held my head down. I remember thinking, she doesn't love me. That next morning, my dad surprised Paul with a minibike, and I remember my dad saying, you have to ride your little sister. We were both so excited. Months passed by. I made sure not to upset my mother, and on one Saturday, Paul had 1 hour to ride his minibike up and down the street. I could hear Paul riding his minibike, and then nothing. I was on the back porch playing with my dolls. I knew Paul had gone past the stop sign at the end of our street. My mother was in the kitchen cooking. Then it happened, like a movie playing in my head. I could see Paul on the ground and the minibike beside him. Paul was crying. I ran into the house shouting, Paul is hurt, Paul is hurt. My mother says, what are you talking about? I told her Paul has fallen on his minibike and he is hurt. She ran outside, minutes later ran back in, and said, I don't see Paul. Where is he? I said, I don't know, but he is hurt. She called the mother of Paul's friend to see if he was over there, but he was not. She went outside several times calling him. Just then, a police car pulled up to our driveway with Paul in the car and the minibike in the trunk. Paul was crying, saying, I'm sorry, Mom, I'm sorry. The police found him 2 blocks over at the park. He had fallen off the bike and had a few scars, but he was okay. My mother was happy to see Paul and thanked the police. We went into the house, and as I watched her tend to Paul's wounds, she looked up at me with a sad expression on her face, with tears running down her face. That was the last day she hugged or kissed me. Faith began to cry, but never stopped telling her story. About a year later, Mother had a cocktail party for the ladies in her social group, which included makeup and hair shows. I loved them. It made me feel close to her because she would let me help, so I made sure not to tell her about anything I saw weeks before the party. We would talk and laugh while setting the tables and making the food, and she would always let me make the punch by myself. She would lay out my princess dress and shoes and say, "What color lip gloss would you like to wear?" I would laugh and say the red, just like you, Mommy. The night of the party, I remember what happened at the end of the night. I was standing on my step stool in front of the kitchen sink, about to wash the silverware. While the water filled the sink, I gazed out the window. It was dark, and I could not see my reflection. Only that night I saw my father sitting at a desk with two men standing beside him, one with a gun. The men were saying, "Sign the paper." I jumped down off the stool and ran to my mother, who was in the middle of cleaning up after the party with two of her friends. I shouted, "A man has a gun on Daddy." She said, "Faith, stop it. What are you talking about?" I remember crying so hard that I could hardly breathe. As Faith looked up with tears streaming down her face, Faith said, "Those visions came more often as I grew older." That particular vision took 10 years for me to realize it happened at that time, and by this time, my mother and father were divorced, and I lived with my father. When I was around 19 years old, one night, I just happened to bring up that night to my father, saying my mom was really mad at me. I looked at my father, who had this shocked look on his face, and said, "I remember that night I was out of town, and that really did happen." That night, I remember telling my dad I could see spirits too, along with a laundry list of other things. My dad listened and simply said, "You have always had these gifts. You're at the age where you need to pray and ask for guidance." He made arrangements for me to have biblical counseling next week. Faith said, "Ladies, the relationship I am having problems with is not just with my mother, it's with everyone. Maybe I should not say anything to new people, men in particular. Let me give you an example of one of many things that have happened. I worked for a Christian magazine, and I had to meet with a minister who was one of the editors of the magazine. I went to his house, and we were in his upstairs office, which, by the way, had glass sliding doors all around the room. He asked me if I wanted something to drink, and I said, "Sure, iced tea if you have it." He said, "Of course, I'll be right back." I sat down and looked around the room, and as I looked at the glass doors, I could see spirits walking around. They looked like transparent people. When he returned, I said, "You sure have a lot of spirits in this house." He grabbed my arm and said, "You can see them?" With his eyes open wide and a smile on his face, he repeated, "You can see them?" I said, "Calm down, yes, I can see them." I said, "You can't?" He said, "No, but they beat on my arms at night." He told me how he was afraid to talk to anyone about it because he didn't want anyone to think he was losing it. I told him to research the house. A few weeks later, he called me and said the house was built on an Indian burial ground. After that, he put the house up for sale. What I am trying to say is, it's hard to have a social life because when you're getting to know someone and telling them about your childhood and adventures, they either think you're lying or find a reason to keep their distance. Would you tell people who come into your life any of these things?